Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your boy Richard Graves of the Richard Graves Group. Thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to the channel. What I'm about to talk to you guys about today, this is something that kind of mixes up a couple things I do. Those of you who know me know that I am actually a DJ, and I started DJing, as I like to say, back when hip hop first came out. Even though that betrays my age, it also means I have an understanding of that particular culture. I grew up with it. That being said, I'm also a historian. So we're going to talk a little history today. And what has made me have this conversation with you all is this whole controversy around Fat Joe. A lot of people are upset with Fat Joe because Fat Joe says the N word. And I thought it would be a good time to talk about the diaspora, a little Atlantic history, so we get to really understand some of the foundations of this. Now, of course, and I think we need to talk about this. We need to talk about the diaspora. We need to talk about Atlantic history because I don't think we've all had this talk in maybe 50 years, really. The last time we were really on this, I believe this was during the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, you had the Pan-African movement that started with Marcus Garvey, and I think it coalesced during the Civil Rights Movement. You had a lot going on in Africa. You had a lot going on, obviously, in the United States. You had people fighting for equality here. You had people fighting for freedom and to be, no longer colonized, over in Africa. And I believe that even at that point, some of our Afro-Latino brothers and sisters were beginning to identify with their Blackness. And let me be clear, there's a difference between Blackness and being African. Blackness and whiteness are things that were created in order to facilitate the transatlantic slave trade. They're not real things in a scientific sense, unless you're talking a social science sense. They're sociological realities that have now become cultural realities. Now, that's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot to unpack in that. So I want to have this conversation in the space of reality, a space of where we're talking about real things, not with politically loaded agendas. Right now, you have a lot of agendas going on that are causing politics for this to be a discussion when honestly it really shouldn't be one. Fat Joe using the N word shouldn't really be a discussion. And when we get through it, I'm going to tell you why it shouldn't be a discussion. But for one, we need to talk about why are we even using the N word to begin with. But that's later on in this discussion. Right now, we're going to talk about it because I understand to some of y'all, it's a term of endearment. I myself use it. I try not to, but I do. It's cultural. It's how we grew up. We grew up using the word. I think that's one of the things that Fat Joe said. He grew up in a predominantly African-American community, even though he's Puerto Rican. And he used the term in New York and in Black, Dominican, and Puerto Rican neighborhoods, they tend to use it. And actually, we have to talk about Latino identity because we have to understand that when you're talking about Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans, that their Blackness, they have Blackness. And I don't think a lot of people understand that because Latinos are different. They're not one group. There are some Latinos that are more, more tied to their European ancestry in Spain. And there's some that look more as what we would call white person white. And there's some that look Black because of their African ancestry. But let me give you guys a little illustration. We're going to talk a little Atlantic history in order for me to give you context of what I'm about to say. So here we go. This is a transatlantic slave map. This represents the slave trade from 1500 up until 1900, I guess. All right. Now, here's the thing. As you see the lines, you see the people, Bantu African people, which is what we now call Black people. But Bantu African people is from West, South, and Central Africa and Eastern Africa were taken throughout the world. As you see, up in parts of Asia, you'll see going up through the Levant, obviously up through Europe. And now we look and we see coming to South, Central America, the Caribbean, and the United States. So let me make this clear. Those of us who consider ourselves Black, we have ancestry from our primary ancestry is from Africa, from these Bantu people. Now, at the time, these Bantu people were not called Black people. All right, let me be clear. At the time, these Bantu people were called Yoruba, Igbo, Ichikiri, Ashanti. There are many, many different nations and tribes, if you want to call them tribes, families, nations in Africa that did not see themselves as one people at all. And in some cases still don't. They see themselves as their group. I'm an Ashanti person. I'm a Husafalani person, whatever it may be. So you have to understand this blackness thing was a forced construct. If you even go to Europe, Europeans didn't see themselves as white. And let me be clear, everybody knows that we see skin color. We know who's darker, who's lighter. This has been throughout history. But these modern concepts, what I mean by modern, within the last 500 years, the concepts of a person being a black person or a white person, that is a construct. It's a sociological construct. Those people did not see themselves as black in Africa, and the people in Europe didn't see themselves as white. They saw themselves as Anglo-Saxons, Welsh, Slavic, Celts, all right? That is how the world saw itself prior to we get to the slave trade thing, okay? And I know that's hard for a lot of you guys to accept or understand, but it's the facts. We have been so caught up in the victimhood of being in our black identity. And I say the victimhood because we're not operating in the pride of it, but the victimhood of it, that we want to act as if all of human history can be seen through that lens. And when you look at human history through that lens, you're going to miss a lot because you're looking through a very narrow lens that's predicated on a modern ideology. But I won't go there. We'll go there later. Let's keep it where it's at. So I gave you guys that map, and I'm going to throw it up again. Gave you guys that map to see that our ancestors, both Fat Joe's, mine, and any other black person looking at this show, came from the same slave boats, all right? And they were all over the Americas, all over South and Central America, all right? So this is why, you have black people in these countries. Now, I'm going to say something that some people aren't going to like. Obviously, you do have colorism in Latin American countries. All right. So, and there is in Latin American countries, like in Puerto Rico, people identify as Puerto Rican before they identify as a black Puerto Rican or a white Puerto Rican. That's very different than in the United States. United States, our blackness is the primary thing and whiteness is how we identify ourselves. So we have to understand there are some differences in our the Latin American countries where some of our African brothers and sisters ended up. So that it explains how they may look at each other. But as we moved, I guess when we got into the 90s, when we did our, X-Clan and Paris, and we were having that pro-black movement at the time, a lot of Afro-Latinos began to identify with their blackness. Now I'm going to say something that's going to be controversial. A lot of y'all ain't going to like it. But black people in South and Central America tend to be more tied to their African ancestry than African Americans. Their real African ancestry. And there's a reason for that, and I'll explain why. African Americans, we tend to have these false mythical histories that we tie ourselves to. We tie ourselves to the history of Egypt. We tie ourselves to the history of the Moors. And I'm not saying there isn't any relationship there, but what we tend to ignore is our primary ancestry, again, with the Igbo, the Ijikiri, the Ashanti, the Husafalani, et cetera, those people, the Zulus, those people groups, because, I think that African Americans have bought into some degree of white supremacy where we see African culture as inferior, and we need to get off that because that would stop us from creating these fantasies and fairy tales and actually embracing the rich and vibrant history of Africa, the actual history of the Ashanti people, of the Ghanaian kingdom, of the kingdom of Axum and Kush. If we knew about those things, and I'm going to do some teachings about that as well, because I swear I always get irritated when I see us making up these fake histories when we have such a rich history to grab. To the point now, there's some black people so ashamed of their blackness from Africa, they created this mythology that they're the actual native people. And if you buy into that, I'm sorry for you. I'm here to tell you it's not true. All right. I'm here to tell you, I'm not saying that there are not African Americans who don't have ancestry with the Native Americans or Amerindians, but to the point where you could take a DNA test and show that you got ancestry from Nigeria, Congo, South Africa, and you still want to delude yourself into saying that, no, I'm not from Africa. I am an original American. That is out of straight up an inferiority complex. You really bought into white supremacy. You want to separate yourself from Africa so much that you've created this mythology. But that's enough for that rant. Because all of this stuff I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do a series of teachings on this because it's necessary. But back to Fat Joe. Okay, so I did say Afro-Latinos tend to have a tighter relationship with their African culture than African Americans. The primary reason for this is when the slaves were brought from Africa to places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Brazil, and parts of Mexico, these slaves were allowed to maintain some of their culture, some of their artwork, some of their language, some of their religion. So when they were brought to these places, they still had that identity. Religions like Santeria. Santeria is a religion that is predicated on the Yoruba religion. All right. I believe the Yoruba religion of Voodoo, I believe it's called. So even in African-American areas in the South, like in Louisiana, where you have hoodoo, voodoo, Santeria, they're all predicated on the African religion. And that's a different class I'll teach about, African religions, the religions of Africa that our people observed prior to coming to the United States or being brought to the United States or brought to the Americas by force. It's like we got on the cruise ship. That being said, or I should say our ancestors. That being said, so that is why you may see Latinos who are very tied to their Africanness, but not so much their Blackness. That's one of the reasons. There's more to it than that. But I'm going to let Fat Joe speak a little bit to the situation himself. I'm going to grab an interview that he did where he talks about some of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to share that with everyone and let him say it in his own words so you guys have a better idea of what he and I am talking about. And let me go ahead and play that so you guys can hear what he's talking about. Sorry, let me mute myself. I don't want to have that echo.
Brazilian music, all of it, Dominican music, Spanish drums, all the music is African music. So, you getting on the Afro beat now. I've been in Africa. They've been doing that. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I mean? It ain't new. All the music is African. You know what I'm saying? But you right. Like, you know what I'm saying? Even in Puerto Rico, when you go to Caribbean, like let's speak about Latinos not being black. Latinos are black. Mm-hmm. In Cuba at one time, there was 8 million Cubans. 5 million, unfortunately, were slaves. 3 million were actual Cubans. And they integrated and had babies. Same thing with Puerto Rico. When you go to Loíza, and when you talk about Santeria, that came from the motherland, Africa. Sometimes Latinos might even identify themselves with African and black culture more than black people. Man, I'm telling you the truth.
What heritage also too, because mainland American slavery is different than.
Let me get that all ended. I'm sorry. That's a good video. You guys should watch the whole video. But that being said, let me talk about what Fat Joe said. So Fat Joe said that you had, like 8 million Cubans at one time. 5 million were slaves. 3 million were Cubans. Let me correct what he said. I know what he was trying to say, but let me break that down. What you had were Amerindians in Cuba and Puerto Rico. I believe they were the same group of Amerindians. And then you had Spanish explorers and Spanish slave traders that brought African slaves to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And yes, they did mix, just like black people up here are mixed. That's why we have black people that range from Vanessa Williams to Wesley Snipes. Same thing down there. That's why we share certain similar colorism issues, but that's a different topic. But let me simply say that that is why, he talked about the music. Music was part of the culture that they maintained. That's why with the different types of Latin, Afro-Caribbean music, that African influence is there. Because again, Latinos or I should say Afro-Latinos in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and places like Brazil, etc., still had that ability to utilize art in that way, culture in that way, to carry over some things from Africa. Whereas in the North, in North America, particularly where, slaves were brought in the American South, with few exceptions. African Americans or slaves were not allowed to, express themselves in their African culture. In fact, up here, it was on purpose. If they, had a slave boat full of, Ashanti, Yoruba, Igbo, Husafalani, different people groups, they would mix them up so they wouldn't be able to talk to each other. It was by means of control. So that being said, let's get to the point of this. Fat Joe, all right, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, even if he identifies with that, I believe he does. So he's by definition, Western definition, that's a Black person. It may not be an African American, it's a Black person. A Black person is a person with ancestry from the slaves in Africa, or even in some cases, a Black person from Africa could be considered an African American, depending on circumstances, as an immigrant. But, and let me touch on that. Right now, we got a couple movements that are insisting on dividing up Black people at the one point where Afro-Latinos are starting to identify with Blackness, not just their Africanness, but their Blackness, and instead of us grouping together, you got movements, and don't get me wrong, their heart may be in the right place. They want reparations, so they're arguing about who should get reparations in America. So now they want to separate from Afro-Latinos and separate from Afro-Caribbeans and people from Africa. And don't get me wrong, once upon a time, those people made sure they separated from us. Let's be clear. There was a vantage point for not identifying with African American. You got Black Cubans who could play baseball when Black Americans couldn't. All right, so there is a reason why some African Americans feel some type of way about aligning themselves with other Black people from the diaspora. So I get that. So I'm not going to say that there's not a old feeling there that people are carrying over that makes them not want to group together. But in places like New York, where you have Cuban, or you have Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and African Americans in the same neighborhoods growing up together, that line isn't so clear. So someone like Fat Joe is going to who grew up in hip hop culture, where the N word is used a lot, is saying the word. Nobody says anything in New York. If you're talking to a group of Puerto Ricans and Blacks and Dominicans and the N word pops up, nobody even flinches. But in other areas, if you go to areas in the South where there aren't any Puerto Ricans and Cubans, or in places where Black people's interactions with Latinos may be with other Latino groups, like perhaps Mexicans or Guatemalans who may not identify as Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latinos, who may identify more with whiteness, there's tensions in those areas. So you take an area like Los Angeles, Blacks and Latinos in Los Angeles have a very different relationship than Blacks and Latinos in New York, who have a very different relationship than Blacks and Latinos in Chicago. There's some similarities to New York and Chicago as far as how Blacks and Puerto Ricans interact. And there can be some similarities to Los Angeles and Chicago to how Blacks and Mexicans somehow interact. And this is not to say anything about any group of people, but I'm just giving you reality on the street, how people get along. So I think a big problem is identifying Latinos as this big inclusive group when they're a very diverse group of people within being Latino, so a Puerto Rican in New York is going to probably have a very different political position than a Mexican person in Texas, who might have a very different position than a Cuban person in Florida, so I think one of the biggest mistakes we have here is trying to identify Latino as just this big all-encompassing thing. All right, so now that we talked a bit about the diaspora, and we talked about Black Latinos, Black Caribbean people, African Americans, a little bit about the history, I'm going to also touch on the N word. All right. So, people want to use the N word, and that's your right, man. Don't get me wrong. It's a free country. Do what you do. Like I say, I try not to use it, but I have used it. I've used it on podcasts before. I had to catch myself, straight up. And I used it with the ER because I was making a point. But people want to say that it's different if you go GA or ER. I get it. That's your right. All right. But let me give you a little history on that word. All right. In 1786, There's a word called nigger, all right, from Scotland, and it's like a Scottish English dialect word. Nigger, from the French négre and the Spanish word negro, all right. The article here I'm reading says, from the earliest usages was the term that carries with it all the contempt and rejection which whites have inflicted on blacks, all right. But as Black African inferiority was at the time a near universal assumption in English-speaking lands, the word in some cases could be used without deliberate insult, but was an insulting word, all right? Even to the point it was applied to Aboriginals, some people in Australia and Polynesia, that would be, Pacific Islands. You see some Black people there, people with Black skin and African features, but that's another discussion. But the word was used for them too by English colonists in those areas, and sometimes the Spanish in places like the Philippines. All right, now people want to reclaim the word as a neutral term or a positive term in Black culture, which I take exception with, because let me be clear, hip hop culture is not Black culture. Hip hop has been influenced by Black culture. Some can even say now that it's become, part of Black culture. But hip hop never started out as a mutually Black thing. It started in the boogie down, people. And in the boogie down, you had Blacks and Latinos, and believe it or not, some white people and some Asians involved with the beginnings of hip hop. All right. It does have a lot of African influences on it. Those of you who know Soul Sonic Force, African Bambaataa, the Zulu Nation, all those things are part of hip hop culture. But the Blacks, the Latinos in New York City, in the Boogie Down Bronx, that's where it was born. Sorry for you people in Brooklyn, but hip hop was born in the Boogie Down, and that's just what it is. So it has never been a solely African or solely Black American culture thing. Now it's become one. I think Black people now have embraced hip hop culture to the point now we actually believe it's synonymous with Black culture. That's why people get so in their feelings with things like Fat Joe, to the point, if you don't even know hip hop culture, you don't know how it's influenced by Latinos and Blacks. If you don't know the culture of New York, you don't understand why Latinos use the N-word. And again, New York is very different. A person in New York saying the N-word, a Puerto Rican or Dominican saying the N-word in the Boogie Down is not going to be taken the same way as a Mexican person saying it to a Black person in LA. Very different situations. And even in Los Angeles, I spend a little time out there in Mexican communities. Mexicans refer to each other often with the N-word, not meaning any insult, just how they talk to each other. But this is what happens when you have something like hip hop that has become so dominant in American culture. These things are going to leak over into the dominant culture to the point where these phrases are going to get picked up and people are going to start using them. That's the problem when you normalize a phrase or a word. Everybody wants to use it because everybody's part of the culture now. All right. There are very few people who don't listen to hip hop, who aren't influenced by hip hop. I don't care if you're white, Black, brown, whatever, because all them records that are being sold, all those downloads and streams, those ain't just Black and Latino people. If it was, they wouldn't be making the money they're making. So when you open the door to try to normalize a phrase, when you open that door, people gonna come through it. So y'all mad at Fat Joe, who probably has every right to say it, predicated on him being of African ancestry, him being from the Boogie Down, from New York. I believe he is from the Bronx. All right. Being from hip hop culture, being from where hip hop culture was birthed, being a person who has, in my observation, has always been part of Blackness. I honestly, I just thought he was Afro-Latino. I never thought twice about it. But again, it all depends on where they're coming from. So I say this to the Black folks that are in their feelings about Fat Joe. Y'all need to get over it, or you need to stop using the word. Because if you think you're going to stop someone with African ancestry, someone who's clearly an Afro-Latino, someone who's clearly from where hip hop was born, someone who's clearly grew up amongst Blacks and Latinos where this was commonplace because of hip hop culture, you think you're going to stop him from saying it? You might. I don't know what type of cancel campaign y'all on, but that's not happening. And honestly, you need to think about it. Either A, stop using the word yourself and say nobody should use it, or B, just accept the fact that you have tried to normalize a word that's now normalized. Because if you can't take Fat Joe saying it, then what happens when, and I know y'all like getting on the little white kids when they're doing the lyrics to or whatever song they listening to of the day, and they slip up and say the word. But at the end of the day, that's the problem when you normalize a term. When you say that you're taking it back, then everybody's going to end up saying it eventually. We can keep trying to police it, but what good is that really going to do? Because American people got freedom of speech. They're going to say what they want to say. But I hope that this brief history gave you guys some context of things and understanding Blackness, African culture. I know I touched on a lot of things. I'm going to do a show where I talk about the fake African history that Black Americans have created for ourselves. We need to get rid of that and embrace some real African history. I'm going to do a show where I talk about, Afro-Latinos and why they are more connected with their African ancestry than often African Americans are, and we're going to do a show where we talk about whiteness and Blackness and what those concepts really mean. But that being said, 30 minutes, I'm up. I got writing to do, academic writing. Y'all got me off my square. All right. That being said, y'all take it light. Peace.